Picture this. You're standing in your kitchen on, say, Tuesday morning. You drop a slice of bread into the toaster, and you get distracted by an email on your phone.
Oh, as we all do, yeah.
Right. And a few minutes later, your kitchen is just completely filled with this acrid smoke. Suddenly, the smoke detector on the ceiling unleashes this piercing, ear-splitting shriek.
It's deafening.
It is.
Yeah.
The dog starts barking frantically, your heart rate spikes to like 140 beats a minute, and you're just waving a tea towel at the ceiling, utterly annoyed.
Yeah, totally chaotic.
But in that moment of chaos, your first thought is rarely, well, this machine is completely broken.
Far from it, yeah. I mean, you might be frustrated by the noise and perhaps a bit embarrassed if your neighbors can hear it, but you implicitly understand that the alarm is simply fulfilling its design.
It's doing the job it was built to do.
Exactly. And it's designed to be incredibly, almost frustratingly sensitive. The engineering logic there is built entirely around asymmetric risk.
Asymmetric risk.
Right. Yeah, because the cost of a false alarm, a bit of transient annoyance, a ruined piece of sourdough, maybe waking up the household, is so infinitesimally small compared to the cost of missing a real fire.
Because missing a real fire means your house burns down. It means you die.
Spot on. The penalty for a false negative is catastrophic, whereas the penalty for a false positive is, well, a minor inconvenience. The engineers who built that smoke detector intentionally calibrated it to err on the side of caution every single time.
Which really brings us to the profound conceptual shift we're exploring today. Because what happens if we take that exact same engineering logic and apply it to the human mind?
Oh, it changes everything.
Right. Specifically, what if we look at deeply distressing psychiatric symptoms? Things like sudden panic or crushing low mood or, crippling social anxiety. We shouldn't look at them immediately as broken machinery.
No, not as a defective brain at all.
Exactly. What if they're an incredibly sophisticated million-year-old smoke detector going off in a modern kitchen?
The implications of that shift are just monumental. Because in routine clinical practice, and frankly in how most of us understand our own psychological struggles, the default instinct is to view psychiatric symptoms as pathology right from the outset.
Yeah, like if you feel terrible, something inside you must be broken.
Right. But viewing these painful states through an evolutionary lens forces us to consider a radically different possibility. These ancient, deeply ingrained alarm systems might be functioning perfectly according to their ancestral design.
But they're just deploying in a modern environment they were never equipped to handle.
Precisely. They're doing their job in the wrong century.
So we're jumping straight into the deep end today. We are doing a deep dive into the evolutionary foundations of psychiatry, and we're drawing our core framework from Kaplan and Sadok's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry.
It's a brilliant text for this.
It really is. And to be clear to you, the listener, we are not treating this like a dry academic lecture or, a trivia session about how cavemen lived.
No, absolutely not. We are dissecting how the brain, the mind, and human experience interact and how that process can go terribly wrong.
Right. Our mission is to build a robust mental model that moves from the underlying biological mechanism to how it manifests in behavior, and finally, to what it actually means when a patient is sitting across from a clinician.
And doing that requires a fundamental change in the questions we ask. Traditional psychiatry often stops at the proximate level.
Meaning the immediate cause.
Exactly. It asks, what is structurally or chemically wrong with this system right now? But evolutionary psychiatry demands we go further. It asks, why did natural selection shape this particular system to be this way in the first place?
And why on earth is it so acutely vulnerable to failure?
Right. We're shifting from asking how a disorder happens to why the human mind harbors the vulnerability for it at all.
To really ground that distinction between the how and the why, we have to look back to the mid-20th century. There was a giant in the field of pathology, the study of animal behavior, named Nico Tinbergen.
Oh, Tinbergen's work is foundational. He proposed a framework that essentially revolutionized biology.
He argued that you can't claim to fully understand any biological trait or behavior by looking at it through a single lens, right?
Yes. He said you need to answer 4 distinct questions, divided into proximate explanations and evolutionary explanations. Tinbergen's 4 questions remain the absolute gold standard for biological inquiry. It's a brilliant matrix.
I always find it helpful to map this onto something mechanical like studying a car.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, so if you're asking approximate question, you're popping the hood and asking how the engine operates in real time. You're examining the fuel injectors, tracing the electrical wiring, checking the spark plugs.
Right, and in a biological organism, this is the mechanism how the parts interact, and the ontogeny, which is how that specific organism developed from a single cell into its current state.
But historically, the entire field of psychiatry has parked itself almost exclusively in that proximate domain, hasn't it?
Almost entirely, yes. A patient presents with severe depression, and the clinical questions immediately focus on the immediate mechanisms. What are the localized serotonin or dopamine levels?
Or how did adverse childhood experiences alter the sensitivity of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis?
Exactly. Which neural pathways in the prefrontal cortex are misfiring? Or developmentally, how did the expression of a specific gene unfold during their adolescence?
And those are incredibly important life-saving questions.
Oh, without a doubt. But they are profoundly incomplete.
Right, because looking at the spark plugs of our car doesn't tell you why the car was built with a steering wheel instead of a tiller, or, why it has a windshield.
It doesn't explain the historical design choices at all.
And those are the ultimate or evolutionary questions. In Tinbergen's framework, those questions ask about phylogeny. So, what is the historical sequence of this trait across millions of years of ancestral species?
And adaptive significance. How did variations in this trait help our ancestors survive and reproduce?
When you bring those evolutionary questions into the clinic, the entire picture just changes.
It really does. We start looking at the human brain as a finished, perfect product that just happened to break. We start seeing it as a cobbled-together survival engine, carrying the historical baggage of millions of generations.
Which means we need to briefly establish the ground rules of that survival engine, the basic algorithmic engine of evolution.
Right, the core mechanics.
I like the Vista mnemonic for this. Have you heard that?
I have, yes. Variation, inheritance, selection, time, leading to adaptation.
Yeah, exactly. It's remarkably straightforward, yet entirely ruthless.
Very ruthless.
Yeah.
If there's genetic variation within a population, and those varied traits can be passed down to offspring, then any trait that confers even a slight survival or reproductive advantage will inevitably become more common over vast stretches of time.
That's adaptation. When the crucial pivot for psychiatry is recognizing that natural selection didn't merely sculpt our physical forms.
No, it didn't just shape the bipedal pelvis or the opposable thumb. It shaped the behavior regulation mechanism itself. It shaped the neurochemistry of the brain.
Okay, I have to jump in here and play devil's advocate for a second.
Yeah.
Because this is precisely the point where people start getting uncomfortable.
I know exactly where you're going with this.
Right. Whenever we start saying that our thoughts, our social behaviors, and our deepest emotions were hammered out by millions of years of blind natural selection just to maximize our survival, it feels incredibly bleak.
It can sound very deterministic.
Yeah, it sounds like evolutionary psychology is just a Trojan horse for rigid genetic determinism. The whole, my genes made me do it, culture doesn't matter, I have no free will argument.
Are we just biological automatons running ancient code?
I am so glad you raised that because it's the single most common and frankly most destructive misconception about evolutionary theory applied to humans.
So we aren't meat robots. Absolutely not. Evolutionary biology is in no way an alternative to learning or the profound impact of culture. Rather, it's the very architect of our capacity to learn.
Okay, how so?
Well, the framework we use to understand this is the concept of facultative adaptations and phenotypic plasticity.
Walk me through facultative adaptation. How does that rescue us from determinism?
Think of a facultative adaptation as an intricate if-then statement coded into our biology. It's a mechanism designed to adjust the phenotype, your observable characteristics or behaviors, in direct response to specific environmental cues.
Oh, okay. Do you have a physical example?
The classic physical example is human skin and sunlight. You don't just have one permanently fixed skin tone that ignores the environment. Your body possesses a sophisticated mechanism to produce more melanin, darkening the skin in response to ultraviolet light exposure.
Right, canning.
Exactly. The capacity to tan is an evolved genetic trait, but the expression of that trait is entirely dependent on the environment. That is plasticity.
So the genes provide the canvas and the paints, but the environment paints the picture.
That's a lovely way to put it. And the human brain is the ultimate, undisputed organ of plasticity. It didn't evolve to execute a fixed, unchangeable script.
It evolved to be exquisitely flexible, to constantly vacuum up data from the environment, to learn complex social rules, and to create culture.
Right. In fact, human evolution is characterized by gene culture coevolution. It's a positive feedback loop where our cultural inventions, like cooking or agriculture, loop back to shape our genetic evolution. Evolution explains why we're so incredibly adaptable, not why we're rigid.
That reframing is vital for you listening. We are highly advanced learning algorithms, not pre-programmed record players. But speaking of behavior and survival, if we are programmed to survive, we have to address the great myth of self-sacrifice.
No, we have to talk about the lemmings.
The poor lemmings. They have been slandered by popular culture for decades.
They really have.
For anyone who doesn't know, there's a pervasive cultural myth that when lemming populations go too large and resources get scarce, large groups of them will spontaneously and heroically throw themselves off cliffs into the sea.
Committing mass suicide for the good of the species, right? It's the ultimate tale of biological self-sacrifice.
But if you dig into the history, you find out this was entirely fabricated. It was staged by documentary filmmakers in the 1950s who literally used brooms to sweep these terrified little rodents off a cliff edge to get dramatic footage.
It's a horrific piece of cinematic history, but it serves as a perfect, morbid illustration of a major fallacy that plagued early evolutionary biology, the concept of group selection.
Meaning the idea that traits evolve for the good of the group.
Exactly. For a long time, even prominent biologists assumed that traits evolved because they benefited the group or the species as a whole. But when you subject that to rigorous mathematical modeling, the theory just collapses.
Because it only takes one selfish individual to ruin the utopia.
Precisely. Natural selection operates on the level of the gene, shaping traits that maximize individual inclusive fitness. Imagine a genuine genetic mutation did arise that made a lemming truly willing to commit suicide for the good of the overpopulated group.
Okay, so that altruistic lemming jumps off the cliff. It dies.
And crucially, its altruistic gene dies with it at the bottom of the ravine. Meanwhile, the selfish lemmings who lack that gene stay safely on the cliff, eat the remaining food, and reproduce.
Wow, so within a single generation, the altruistic gene is entirely wiped out of the gene pool. Traits that severely harm the individual for the benefit of unrelated strangers simply cannot evolve.
They cannot. The math doesn't work.
But wait, if evolution is strictly a ruthless game of individual fitness, if we are entirely driven by Richard Dawkins' concept of the selfish gene, how do we account for humanity? We are an intensely cooperative species.
We are, yes.
You read stories about people jumping onto subway tracks to pull complete strangers out of the way of a train. Parents will routinely sacrifice their health, their wealth, and their lives for their children. If the math of evolution dictates selfishness, shouldn't we all be pure, calculating sociopaths?
It's a great paradox. The resolution to that paradox came from the evolutionary biologist William Hamilton, who introduced the concept of kin selection. And he summarized it with the deceptively simple mathematical formula known as Hamilton's rule. C must be less than B multiplied by R.
Let's translate that algebra into human behavior for us.
Sure. C represents the biological cost to the individual performing the altruistic act. B is the reproductive benefit gained by the recipient of the act. And R is the crucial variable, the coefficient of relatedness, or the percentage of genes the two individuals share by common descent.
Okay.
Hamilton proved mathematically that a genetic variant promoting altruistic behavior will successfully spread through a population if the cost to the altruist is less than the benefit to the recipient, multiplied by their degree of genetic relatedness.
So to put some brutal numbers to it, I share 50% of my genes with my brother. If a burning building is collapsing from a purely genetic, evolutionary standpoint, a gene that makes me sacrifice my own life to save exactly one brother wouldn't spread, because the math is a net zero or worse. But a gene that compels me to sacrifice my life to save 3 brothers, that gene thrives, because 150% of my genetic equivalent survives. Or I'd sacrifice myself for 8 cousins, since I share 12.5% with each.
The biologist J.B.S. Haldane famously quipped exactly that before the math was formalized. The gene itself is entirely selfish. Its only imperative is replication.
But the most efficient way for a selfish gene to ensure its own survival is often to build an organism that is selectively generous to the other bodies, carrying copies of that same gene.
It explains the profound biological devotion a mother has for her child. She will starve herself so the infant can eat because the genes are securing their own future through the offspring.
Inclusive fitness.
Yes, inclusive fitness includes both your direct reproduction and the impact you have on the reproduction of your relatives. This mechanism is the bedrock for understanding human family dynamics.
It explains the evolutionary necessity of attachment, too. and even the intense visceral grief we experience when a loved one dies.
Right. The loss of a child is a catastrophic blow to an individual's inclusive fitness, and the psychological pain reflects that biological reality.
Okay, so we've established a solid foundation. The brain is an evolved organ, shaped by natural selection to maximize inclusive fitness, incredibly plastic, and capable of profound kin-based cooperation.
That's the baseline, yes.
But let's bring this directly into the psychiatric clinic. If natural selection is such an impossibly powerful, refining force over millions of years, why are we so sick?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. Why hasn't evolution weeded out the alleles for schizophrenia? Why do we suffer from severe depression or crippling anxiety? If evolution optimizes for survival, why are the waiting rooms of psychiatrists completely full?
That is the defining question of evolutionary medicine. And the fundamental insight that resolves this paradox is this: natural selection does not shape diseases. It shapes physical and behavioral traits that leave us vulnerable to diseases. The sources we're analyzing outline 6 distinct evolutionary explanations for why every single human being shares an inherent vulnerability to psychiatric and medical conditions.
Let's explore these 6 vulnerabilities thoroughly, because this is where the listener's mental model is going to fundamentally shift.
Let's do it.
The first vulnerability is the concept of mismatch with modern environments. And this is perhaps the easiest to visualize.
Yeah, right.
We're walking around with ancient brains wired over millions of years on the African savanna, and we're suddenly forcing them to navigate fluorescent-lit office cubicles, labyrinthine tax bureaucracies, endless feeds of social media, and unlimited access to high-fructose corn syrup.
The environment has changed at a blinding speed, while our biological evolution crawls at a glacial pace. Our behavior regulation mechanisms were never shaped to cope with modern novelties.
It makes so much sense.
Consider a physical example like myopia or nearsightedness. Myopia is highly heritable. The genes for it are clearly present in the population. Yet when you look at contemporary hunter-gatherer populations, myopia is incredibly rare.
Wait, really? So it's not just bad genetics?
No, it only manifests as a widespread population-level disease when children are chronically exposed to early, close-up reading and modern artificial indoor lighting during their ocular development.
Oh, wow. So the genes predisposing someone to myopia are not defects. They are harmless quirks that only cause pathology when placed in a mismatched environment.
Exactly. And we see this mismatch absolutely everywhere in psychiatry. Take the obesity epidemic in eating disorders.
Right. Because in an ancestral environment, sweet and fatty foods were incredibly rare and packed with life-saving calories.
Yes, the brain evolved a massive reward circuit to make us crave them relentlessly. But you drop that same ancient brain into a modern supermarket aisle filled with ultra-processed foods.
And that life-saving craving mechanism is completely hijacked. It leads straight to binge eating, metabolic syndrome, and intense psychological distress.
The same logic applies to attention and focus. Having a highly reactive, easily distracted attention span might have been a critical lifesaver if you needed to constantly monitor the rustling grass for predators or track fast-moving prey.
But force that same highly reactive brain to sit at a desk for 8 hours, staring at a spreadsheet, and suddenly that survival mechanism is labeled as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The trait hasn't changed, the demands of the environment have.
Brilliant way to put it. But I imagine we have to be careful not to use mismatch as a blanket excuse for everything.
Right. It's a common trap to assume everything is a mismatch. The environment is a major factor, but is not the only one. Which brings us to the second vulnerability, coevolution with fast-evolving pathogens.
The environment isn't just static buildings and junk food. The biological environment is actively trying to kill us.
The evolutionary arms race.
Exactly. Pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites reproduce and mutate at a rate vastly faster than human hosts can. A bacterium can go through thousands of generations in the time it takes a human to reach reproductive age.
So every time human biology evolves a defensive lock, pathogens evolve a new key.
Precisely. And the collateral damage from this microscopic war frequently causes severe psychiatric symptoms.
The sources detail a chilling example of this with Streptococcus bacteria.
It's a remarkable and deeply concerning mechanism. Certain strains of Streptococcus have evolved in evolutionary camouflage. They possess molecular markers on their surface that closely mimic human tissues. They are hiding in plain sight.
So our bodies don't know they're there.
Not at first. When the human immune system finally detects the bacteria and mounts a violent attack, it can become confused by the camouflage. The antibodies can accidentally cross-react and begin attacking the host's own healthy tissues.
And when this friendly fire targets the basal ganglia in the brain, it can lead to rheumatic fever, Sydenham's chorea, and sudden severe onset of obsessive-compulsive disorder and neurologic disorders in children.
Yes, this phenomenon is broadly referred to as PENDAS.
So a child suddenly developing severe OCD symptoms might not have a primary psychiatric chemical imbalance in the traditional sense. They are experiencing neurological collateral damage from an immune system tricked by a fast-evolving bacteria.
That's spot on. And the textbook notes that this isn't limited to rare syndromes. High systemic inflammation, which is essentially our immune system deploying a scorched earth defense policy against pathogens, is now strongly linked to the etiology of major depression and even Alzheimer's disease.
Our own defensive weapons are so aggressive they cause secondary psychiatric damage. That's terrifying.
It is. Which segues seamlessly into the third vulnerability, constraints. There are simply things that natural selection cannot do.
The analogy often used here is that evolution is not a master engineer drafting a perfect blueprint from scratch. Evolution is a blind tinkerer. It has to work with the spare parts it already has lying around.
The vertebrate eye is the quintessential example of an evolutionary constraint. Due to a historical quirk in our development, the optic nerve and blood vessels enter the back of the human eyeball in a way that passes through the retina, creating a literal, unavoidable blind spot in our vision.
But cephalopods, like the octopus, evolved eyes along a different lineage, right?
Yes, and their neural wiring sits behind the retina, a much more logical design with no blind spot. But mammals are trapped by the evolutionary baggage of our distant ancestors. We cannot start over.
We see a similar dangerous constraint in human obstetrics, don't we? The narrow human birth canal is a perilous evolutionary compromise between bipedal walking and an enormously expanded brain size. It makes human childbirth uniquely dangerous compared to other primates.
Absolutely. So how do these physical constraints translate into psychiatric vulnerability?
They translate directly into our cognitive architecture. Human cognitive biases, our reliance on flawed heuristics, the ways we jump to wildly irrational conclusions under stress.
These aren't glitches in a perfect computer. They are the result of highly complex, modern decision-making requirements being duct-taped onto simpler, ancient neural circuits that were originally designed for quick, binary survival judgments.
Like fight or flight, not for objective truth or long-term planning. Our emotion regulation systems frequently fail because they are patched together networks tinkered with over millennia, rather than elegantly designed circuits.
That concept of compromise leads perfectly into the fourth vulnerability, trade-offs. In evolution, there's no such thing as a free lunch.
No biological trait is optimized without exacting a cost somewhere else. The textbook uses the classic Darwinian example of finches.
Right. If a finch evolves a massive, heavily muscled beak, it gains the incredible advantage of being able to crack open tough, hard seeds, allowing it to survive devastating droughts when soft food disappears.
But that exact same massive beak is entirely useless for delicate work, like picking up tiny, nutrient-dense seeds for the ground. The physical advantage mandates a physical limitation.
Exactly. Let's apply that trade-off to a psychological trait. What's the mental equivalent of the massive finch beak?
Oh, consider the spectrum of anxiety. Imagine an individual with a highly reactive, easily triggered anxiety system. They're hypervigilant.
The immense benefit of this trait is that they're fantastic at avoiding danger. They will never be caught off guard by a predator. They will meticulously avoid fatal social missteps that could lead to ostracization.
But the severe trade-off is that their constant state of alarm paralyzes them. They might be too terrified to explore new territory for better food, or too anxious to approach a new potential mate, or too risk-averse to forge new social alliances.
The trait that guarantees you won't be killed in one context fundamentally limits your ability to thrive in another.
Which flows directly into the fifth, and I think the most uncomfortable, vulnerability for clinicians and patients to accept: reproduction at a cost to health.
This requires a massive paradigm shift in how we view biology. We instinctively want to believe that our bodies are designed to keep us healthy and happy.
But natural selection does not care about your health. It does not care about your happiness. It certainly does not care about your longevity. Its only currency is inclusive fitness. How many copies of your genes make it into the next generation?
That is a brutal reality to confront.
It is. If a specific gene variant makes you suffer terribly, or even guarantees you'll drop dead of a heart attack at age 40, but that same gene guarantees you will have 10 healthy children before you die.
Natural selection will enthusiastically favor that gene over one that makes you live blissfully to 100 years old but leaves you infertile.
Absolutely. The genes for reproduction will always outcompete the genes for longevity if they are in conflict. And the most striking, undeniable data point highlighting this phenomenon is the stark mortality difference between young men and young women.
Across almost all modern societies, male mortality in early adulthood is roughly 3 times higher than female mortality.
3 times higher. That's a staggering statistic. Is that entirely driven by the biological imperative to compete for mates?
Largely, yes, it's the visible outcome of sexual selection. In mammalian mating systems, including human ancestral environments, the variance in male reproductive success is enormous compared to females.
Because a single dominant male could potentially father dozens of children, while a marginalized male might father none.
Exactly. For females, the variance is much narrower. Most females will reproduce, but the biological limit on the number of offspring is strictly capped by the time and immense caloric cost of pregnancy and nursing.
Therefore, evolution aggressively selected for traits in males that heavily promote mating competition, aggressive status seeking, and extreme risk-taking.
It's selected for these traits even when they directly jeopardize the individual's physical health and longevity.
So when a 19-year-old man takes a corner on a motorcycle at 100 miles an hour, or engages in a violent bar fight over a perceived insult, he isn't necessarily expressing a Freudian death wish or a primary pathology.
No, he is exhibiting an ancient risk-taking algorithm that, in an ancestral environment, might have successfully signaled high status, intimidated rivals, and secured mating opportunities, even though in a modern environment it just results in a catastrophic trauma admission.
Sensible caution, meticulous tissue repair, and longevity are relatively more favored in females because female reproductive success requires immense long-term physiological and social investment to raise an infant in independence. The mother must physically survive the next decade to ensure the child survives.
But the male, from a cold biological standpoint, merely needs to survive long enough to secure the mating opportunity.
That completely flips our understanding of psychiatric vulnerability on its head. When we look at the significantly higher rates of anxiety disorders diagnosed in women, an evolutionary perspective suggests that women might actually possess an anxiety baseline that is much closer to the optimal set point for personal health and physical survival.
Meanwhile, young men have a biologically programmed deficit of anxiety, a reckless hypophobia that benefits the transmission of their genes but frequently destroys their bodies.
It's a profound realization that the pathology of excessive caution might be the healthy baseline for survival, and the normalcy of male risk-taking is the true biological aberration sacrificing the body for the gene.
And that tension leads us to the final and arguably most clinically relevant vulnerability, defenses, returning us to the smoke detector principle we opened with.
Let's really drill down into the mathematics of panic, because this logic fundamentally changed how I view anxiety.
Imagine you are an early hominid foraging on the African savanna. You are alone collecting roots, and suddenly you hear a distinct rustling in the tall grass just behind you.
Okay, setting the scene.
You face an immediate binary choice. The rustling could be a harmless monkey, or it could be a hunting lion. You can either trigger a massive energy-intensive panic attack and sprint for the nearest tree, or you can suppress your fear and stay put to continue gathering food.
Let's run the evolutionary calculus on that decision. We evaluate the costs of being wrong. If you panic and run away, but it was only a monkey, a false positive, what did it cost you?
Let's say it costs you 100 calories of burned energy and a few minutes of lost foraging time. It is annoying, but trivial.
However, if you choose to stay put, assuming it is just a monkey, but it actually is a lion, a false negative, what does that cost you?
It costs you 100,000 calories, it costs you your life, and your entire future reproductive potential goes to zero.
Because of that extreme asymmetry and risk, the optimal biological system will not wait for certainty. It will trigger a full-blown, terrifying panic attack, even if the statistical probability of a lion being present is only 1 in 1,000.
Which leads to the astonishing clinical takeaway. Out of 1,000 panic responses triggered by that rustling grass, 999 of them are objectively false alarms.
You run away from the wind.
Yeah.
You run away from a monkey. You experience severe physiological terror for absolutely no reason. But those 999 false alarms are completely biologically normal.
They are not a sign that the brain's circuitry is broken. They are a sign that the system is calibrated perfectly to prioritize survival over subjective comfort.
This mathematically rigorous framing fundamentally changes the dynamic when a psychiatrist sits down with a patient suffering from panic disorder or severe health anxiety. Yes, the panic is causing immense suffering, and yes, the clinical goal is to treat it and relieve that distress.
But the clinician stops telling the patient, either implicitly or explicitly, that their brain is malfunctioning or damaged. They explain that the brain is doing exactly what it was brilliantly designed to do to keep them alive. The smoke detector is just stuck in the on position because modern stressors are constantly pinging it.
Reframing symptoms as functioning defensive adaptations that have become dysregulated heavily reduces the patient's shame. It makes them far more willing to engage in difficult therapies, like exposure therapy, because they no longer feel fundamentally broken.
Exactly. It's incredibly empowering.
I want to pivot the conversation from external threats, like lions and pathogens, to internal biology. We established earlier, when discussing kin selection, that relatives cooperate.
Yes.
It seems intuitive that the safest, most cooperative environment in human biology would be inside the womb.
Mm-hmm.
A mother and her growing fetus share an unbreakable bond. They're a team working toward a common goal.
Mm.
But the textbook shatters that assumption entirely.
It does. Evolutionary biology reveals a deeply unsettling reality. Far from being a peaceful sanctuary, the womb is the site of a brutal, microscopic genetic conflict known as genomic imprinting.
A literal biochemical tug-of-war
Mm.
between the genes inherited from the mother and the genes inherited from the father fought within the body of the fetus.
Right.
What could they possibly be fighting over?
They're fighting over maternal resources, specifically how many nutrients the fetus is allowed to extract from the mother's bloodstream.
That's wild.
To understand why, you must look at the differing evolutionary incentives. Let's look at the paternal genome, the father's genes operating inside the fetus. From the perspective of the paternal gene, its sole objective is the survival of this specific fetus.
Because the father has no guarantee that the mother's future pregnancies will be his, she might mate with a different male.
Therefore, the paternal genes aggressively push the fetus to extract absolute maximum nutrition to grow as large and robust as possible, even at severe cost to the mother's health.
Wow. And the maternal genome is fighting back.
The maternal genome has a much broader agenda. The mother shares 50% of her genes with this fetus, which is true, but she will also share 50% of her genes with all her future offspring.
So her genetic imperative is to survive this current pregnancy without being dangerously depleted, to limit the resource extraction by the current fetus, and to preserve her physiological capital for future reproduction.
Exactly. So they are literally battling at a molecular level over blood sugar and nutrients.
How does this war actually manifest in biology?
It manifests through highly specialized alleles, such as the gene that produces insulin-like growth factor 2, or IGF-2. The father's genetic contribution actively pushes for the high expression of IGF-2 to stimulate aggressive fetal tissue growth.
In direct response, the mother's genetic contribution pushes for the expression of the IGF-2 receptor gene. That acts as a sponge to soak up and neutralize the father's growth factor, attempting to keep the baby smaller and less demanding.
In a healthy pregnancy, these opposing forces reach a tense equilibrium, and the baby is born at a normal weight. But if this imprinting balance is disrupted, you see pathological extremes of overgrowth or undergrowth.
And the source material takes this molecular biology and connects it to psychiatry in a way that feels almost like science fiction, referencing the work of evolutionary biologist Bernard Crespi.
Crespi's hypothesis is one of the most provocative ideas in modern evolutionary psychiatry. It remains speculative, but the explanatory power is brilliant.
He proposed that this genetic tug-of-war in the womb might lay the neurodevelopmental groundwork for the autism and schizophrenia spectrums.
He suggests that autism might reflect an imprinting imbalance where the paternal genome exerts unbridled influence, driving excessive brain growth and resulting in heavier birth weights, and a cognitive phenotype focused heavily on mechanistic systemizing intelligence.
And schizophrenia would be the reverse.
Exactly. Schizophrenia and related psychotic spectrum disorders might reflect the excess influence of the maternal genome, correlating clinically with lighter birth weights, slower initial growth, and a cognitive trajectory skewed towards hypermentalizing.
Meaning an overactive tendency to perceive hidden intentions and complex social narratives, which in its extreme form manifests as paranoia and delusions.
It's stunning to think that a microscopic battle for resources before birth could shape the fundamental architecture of a mind decades later.
And as the textbook points out, this parent-offspring conflict does not magically end at birth. It simply shifts arenas into what is known as the weaning conflict.
The weaning conflict is a beautiful mathematical demonstration of kin selection turning into kin conflict. Consider the decision of when a mother should stop breastfeeding her infant.
The mother and the infant share 50% of their genes. But, and this is the crucial distinction, the infant shares 100% of its genes with itself.
So their evolutionary priorities are close but not identical. As the infant grows and becomes physically capable of consuming solid food, a biological tipping point approaches. From the mother's genetic perspective, continuing the massive caloric drain of nursing delays her ability to regain fertility and have another child.
Having another child increases her inclusive fitness.
Yeah.
So she wants to stop nursing.
But the infant strongly disagrees. From the infant's genetic perspective, it is mathematically vastly superior to continue extracting high-quality, free resources for itself, which it is 100% related to, rather than prematurely give up those resources for a hypothetical future sibling it will only be 50% related to.
So the infant cries, throws tantrums, and demands to nurse while the mother tries to pull away. But they don't fight forever.
They don't, because the maths eventually resolves the conflict. As the infant gets larger, the caloric cost to the mother becomes so extreme that it threatens her survival, and thereby threatens the infant's own inclusive fitness, because losing the mother would be catastrophic.
Furthermore, the infant eventually benefits more from having a new sibling carrying 50% of its genes than it benefits from a few extra ounces of breast milk.
At that precise mathematical intersection, the evolutionary interests finally align, the infant naturally loses interest in nursing, and the weaning conflict ceases.
Okay, we've covered incredible depths of biological theory, from the Savannah smoke detector to molecular wars in the placenta. But let's bridge this deep biology directly to the clinical interview.
Let's do that.
Imagine a psychiatrist sitting in a room with a patient who was experiencing profound distress today. How does this theoretical framework actually alter the conversation?
To operationalize this, clinicians turn to a branch of evolutionary study called behavioral ecology. This field examines how organisms allocate their limited time and energy to influence their fitness. Every animal, humans included, has a finite energy budget.
They must constantly divide their effort between somatic effort gathering calories, building shelter, maintaining health reproductive effort finding mates, competing for attention, raising children, and social effort building alliances, securing status, navigating hierarchies.
And to track where a patient is directing that effort, the sources introduce a fantastic, highly practical mnemonic for clinicians, the SOCIAL review.
In traditional medicine, a doctor performs a physical review of systems. They listen to the heart, percuss the lungs, palpate the abdomen to find the pathology. The evolutionary psychiatrist performs a review of social systems to locate the exact source of evolutionary stress.
The SOCIAL mnemonic organizes the critical domains of human evolutionary resources. S stands for social status, friendships, and group alliances.
O is for occupation, representing valued social roles and hierarchy.
C is for children, family, and kin networks.
I stands for income, wealth, and material resources.
A is for abilities, physical appearance, and health.
And L stands for love, sexual relationships, and pair bonding. So let's walk through a hypothetical scenario. A patient, let's call him David, a 45-year-old corporate lawyer, comes into the clinic presenting with severe insomnia, generalized anxiety, and a feeling of impending doom.
The traditional approach might be to diagnose generalized anxiety disorder and prescribe an SSRI to fix the serotonin levels. How does the SOCIAL review change that?
The evolutionary psychiatrist uses the SOCIAL review to map David's resource allocation. You ask, what resources does David currently have? What is he desperately trying to achieve? Where is his energy going?
You discover that David is working 80 hours a week. He is pouring massive, disproportionate energy into the income and occupation domains.
But in doing so, his love and children domains are completely starved of effort. His marriage is failing, and he never sees his kids. Furthermore, his abilities and health domain is crashing due to exhaustion.
He is experiencing biological frustration. The vast majority of psychological stress arises because intense efforts to secure one evolutionary resource actively destroy the ability to secure another.
David's brain is sounding the alarm, manifesting as insomnia and dread, because his kin network and pair bond, which are critical survival resources, are dying.
The distress is grounded in biological reality. He doesn't just have a chemical imbalance. His ancient brain is correctly assessing that his current strategy is leading to evolutionary ruin.
And this brings us to one of the most fascinating translations of animal behavior to human psychology in the entire deep dive. Foraging theory, specifically applied to the modern workplace or relationships.
We are talking about the Sharnov marginal value theorem. It is a stunningly elegant piece of behavioral ecology that explains so much of our daily emotional fluctuation.
To understand it, let's picture a bird arriving at a brand new, untouched berry bush. When the bird first lands, the bush is laden with fruit.
The bird eats rapidly. It barely has to move to find a berry. The caloric payoff per minute of effort is massive, but as the bird continues to eat, the easy berries disappear.
It has to hop to harder-to-reach branches, dig under leaves. It takes longer and longer to find the next berry. The rate of caloric payoff steadily drops.
Now, bird's brain faces a critical life-or-death decision. When exactly should it stop foraging, abandon this depleting bush, and spend the massive amount of energy required to fly across the forest to find a new, unknown bush?
If the bird is overly optimistic and leaves too early, it wastes precious energy flying around aimlessly when there was still good food left.
But if the bird is too cautious and stays at the depleted bush too long, it will slowly starve to death while expending energy searching empty branches.
And the maths of the Sharnov theorem dictates that the optimal strategy is to abandon the current patch the exact moment that the rate of return drops below the average rate of return across the entire forest.
The bird's tiny brain intuitively runs this incredibly complex calculus-level algorithm to maximize caloric intake. And human brains run that exact same ancient algorithm nonstop. But we don't just apply it to finding berries.
We apply it to our attention span, our mood, and our most complex social structures. We apply it to our careers and our marriages.
Let's map the berry bush onto a modern career. Think about the dopamine rush of starting an exciting new job. It is the psychological equivalent of landing on a fresh berry bush.
The novelty is high. You're rapidly acquiring new skills, gaining new status, forming new alliances. The emotional and social payoffs are huge.
But inevitably, as years pass, the novelty wears off. You master the skills, the promotions slow down, the office politics become tedious, the easy gains have been extracted, the rate of emotional and financial payoff declines.
The patch is depleting.
Yes, and your ancient brain is constantly, unconsciously calculating the flight time. It is weighing the safety of the stagnant, depleting patch, the boring job, against the massive energy cost and risk of quitting, searching the job market, and starting over.
When patients present to clinics complaining of profound demoralization, a lack of focus, midlife crises, or what psychiatrists call attention shifts, they are often actively trapped in the middle of this unconscious foraging calculation.
So feeling utterly bored and unfulfilled by a 10-year career isn't necessarily a pathology. It is the internal alarm system telling you that the current patch is no longer yielding enough sustenance to justify your time.
Deciding when to leave a depleted patch is one of the most agonizing decisions humans make. And reframing it this way normalizes the intense anxiety that accompanies a major life change.
Which leads us to the broader topic of the phylogeny of emotions. If the brain is running these complex algorithms to manage our SOCIAL resources and decide when to abandon patches, the emotions are the output signals of those algorithms. They are the dashboard lights forcing us to pay attention.
And the sources emphasize that we need to dispel the popular myth that emotions are just arbitrary, separate categories, like the distinct little characters inside the movie Inside Out, or that they're just simple dimensions of positive versus negative.
Categorizing emotions merely as good or bad is clinically useless. Emotions are overlapping clusters of physiological changes, cognitive biases, and behavioral urges that were shaped by natural selection to cope with specific recurring situations in our ancestral past.
They are highly specialized modes of operation, and the most profound implication of this view is that bad feelings possess immense utility. We evolved them because they are necessary. Let's examine the dark triad of difficult emotions, starting with anxiety. We touched on the smoke detector of sudden panic, but generalized anxiety is slightly different, isn't it?
Fear is the acute response to an immediate predator. Anxiety is the sustained anticipation of distant threats, ambiguous danger, or complex social risks. Anxiety is the emotion that forces you to constantly calculate the future. Crucially, anxiety prevents us from taking short-term gains at the cost of long-term social ruin.
Give me an example of social anxiety saving someone's life.
In a hunter-gatherer tribe, you might be hungry, and you see your neighbor has left a piece of meat unguarded. The short-term gain is obvious. Steal the meat, get the calories.
Yeah.
But the anxiety system projects the future. If I am caught stealing, the tribe will expel me. Expulsion from the tribe means starvation and death in the wilderness. The anxiety of being judged and punished overrides the hunger, preventing the theft.
So a complete lack of anxiety is incredibly dangerous.
Yes, the clinical term is hypophobia. Individuals with severely deficient social anxiety suffer massive losses. They make offensive remarks, alienate their allies, fail to prepare for winter, and end up socially isolated or dead. But because they do not feel the subjective internal pain of anxiety, they almost never show up in psychiatric clinics seeking help. The clinical population is entirely skewed toward those with hypersensitive anxiety alarms.
What about jealousy? It is universally despised, it destroys marriages, triggers domestic violence, and causes immense suffering. How can an evolutionary lens possibly redeem jealousy?
It is undeniably toxic in its extremes, but you must consider the ancestral evolutionary stakes. In human history, the threat of losing a mate or mate's fidelity was an event with catastrophic consequences for inclusive fitness. Human males invest massive amounts of time and resources into child rearing, an investment that only makes evolutionary sense if paternity is absolute. Similarly, females relied heavily on male provisioning to survive pregnancy. A specialized emotion evolved specifically to guard that vital resource.
But jealousy frequently makes people act completely irrationally. They scream, they throw things, they sabotage their own lives.
And that perceived irrationality is the core of the strategy. If we look at game theory, which studies strategic decision-making, we learn that in certain high-stakes conflicts, being perfectly rational and predictable is a fatal weakness. If your rival knows exactly how you will react, if they know you will calmly discuss the issue, they can manipulate you without fear. But if the emotion of jealousy makes you visibly unpredictable, volatile, and capable of explosive, disproportionate rage, you become terrifying. It serves as a highly successful deterrent against mate poaching. The irrationality is the feature, not a bug. It benefits the survival of the gene, even as it destroys the happiness of the individual.
Okay, here is the ultimate challenge to the evolutionary framework: low mood and clinical depression. I understand the utility of anxiety to avoid danger, but what possible evolutionary benefit is there to being so profoundly, crushingly depressed that you cannot get out of bed, cannot eat, and wish to die? How does total paralysis help your gene survive?
You are touching on one of the most fiercely debated areas in evolutionary psychiatry. However, the sources present a highly plausible and clinically influential hypothesis: the concept of involuntary yielding.
Let's unpack that carefully, because telling a depressed patient that their depression is a survival mechanism sounds deeply counterintuitive.
Imagine an ancestral scenario where you are pursuing a massive, life-defining goal, but the tragic reality is that the goal is completely unreachable. Perhaps you are trapped in an unwinnable status competition with a rival who is vastly stronger than you. Or you are relentlessly foraging for food in a barren winter landscape where none exists.
Modern society's instinct, and often our therapeutic instinct, is to say, keep fighting, push through the pain, stay positive, and never give up.
And from a cold evolutionary standpoint, staying positive in that specific, unwinnable situation is fatal. If you keep challenging the stronger rival because you are stubbornly optimistic, they will eventually kill you. If you keep burning calories, walking through the snow, searching for berries that aren't there, you will burn your final fat reserves and freeze to death.
So the body has to force you to stop.
Exactly. Low mood kicks in as the ultimate overriding emergency brake. When efforts to reach a goal are continuously fruitless, low mood is aroused. It saps your physical energy, obliterates your motivation, and destroys your optimism. It forces you to stop wasting precious energy. It makes you pause, sit down, experience yourself as helpless, and eventually forces you to give up the unreachable goal. In the context of a tribal status competition, this involuntary yielding signals to the dominant rival that you are completely defeated and no longer a threat, which prevents them from executing you. It is a profoundly painful, humiliating state, but it is an adaptation designed to prevent an even worse outcome: death.
So when a clinician sees a patient with a depression that persists for months or years, is the evolutionary interpretation that the person is literally unable to let go of an unreachable goal?
Very frequently, yes. The modern world traps us in unreachable goals that are conceptual rather than physical. Think of the devoted parent desperately trying to save a child from severe end-stage addiction, but failing. Or a professional whose entire sense of identity is tethered to a failing business. They cannot physically or psychologically let go. And so, the low mood escalates from a normal, temporary adaptive pause into a crushing clinical depression. The internal smoke detector is blaring, screaming at them to abandon the burning building, but their sense of duty or identity traps them inside.
This reframing is incredibly potent. It moves depression from a random biological failure to a profound, albeit agonizing, attempt at self-preservation. Let's take these broad concepts and apply them directly to how psychiatrists conceptualize specific major disorders. Let's start with the most severe, schizophrenia. If natural selection is constantly purging harmful genetic mutations, why hasn't it eliminated the alleles for schizophrenia? It causes a massive reduction in reproductive success. Individuals with schizophrenia have far fewer children.
It is arguably the greatest evolutionary puzzle in psychiatry. We know it is not simply a mismatch with the modern environment because the prevalence rates of schizophrenia are relatively stable across wildly different cultures globally, including non-industrialized societies. Furthermore, massive genetic studies show that the hundreds of common genetic alleles linked to schizophrenia only have tiny, incremental individual effects.
So there is no single broken schizophrenia gene that evolution forgot to delete.
No. The prevailing and most compelling hypothesis is that schizophrenia represents a cliff edge fitness effect.
Explain the cliff edge.
Think about the selective breeding of racehorses. Breeders select horses with longer, lighter, thinner leg bones because less weight means faster running times. Up to a certain point, this intense selection provides a massive competitive advantage. But if you push that selection too far, you move the biology uncomfortably close to the edge of a cliff. Suddenly, the bone is so thin and brittle that an awkward step during a race causes a catastrophic, fatal snap.
The system is pushed to its absolute physical limit until it breaks.
Precisely. Human cognitive evolution has pushed certain traits to staggering extremes to give us our unprecedented intelligence. We have massive brains, extensive neuron pruning during adolescence, vastly complex language networks, and hyper-advanced social cognition. Evolution pushed our neural architecture right to the edge of the cliff to make us human. But by existing so close to that edge, standard genetic variation combined with environmental stress occasionally pushes an individual's developing brain over the precipice, resulting in the systemic cognitive and perceptual failure we label as schizophrenia.
That brings a profound dignity to the condition. The vulnerability to schizophrenia is the inevitable biological tax our species pays for our highest cognitive abilities. Let's shift to eating disorders like anorexia and bulimia nervosa. You touched on the mismatch theory earlier. How does evolutionary psychiatry approach these deeply entrenched behaviors?
Eating disorders are tragic, perfect storms of evolutionary mismatch. To understand them, you have to realize that in our ancestral environment, a sudden, strict drop in daily caloric intake meant only one thing: a severe famine had arrived.
The environment was signaling that you were going to starve to death.
Yes. So the ancient brain reacts with aggressive, adaptive countermeasures. It triggers an overwhelming, obsessive biological drive to seek food manifesting as binge eating to secure any available calories. Simultaneously, it alters the basal metabolism to hoard and store as much fat as possible to survive the impending starvation.
But in the modern world, that strict drop in calories is almost never a famine. It is a voluntary diet, driven by modern cultural ideals of extreme thinness and enacted in an environment with unlimited access to high-calorie food.
Exactly. The cycle is devastating. A patient, influenced by modern media, begins a strict diet. The ancient brain registers a famine and seizes control, triggering an uncontrollable binge. The patient, surrounded by an abundance of food, binges. This massive caloric intake directly violates their psychological goal of thinness, which triggers intense guilt, panic, and a renewed, desperate resolve to restrict their intake even more severely the next day.
Creating a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle. Understanding this ancient famine mechanism must be deeply therapeutic in a clinical setting. It moves the conversation away from the shame of, I have no willpower, to the biological reality of, my brain is desperately trying to save me from starving.
It is incredibly powerful. When patients realize their body is not stubbornly fighting their goals, but is rather fighting for their survival based on outdated ancestral programming, it radically reduces self-loathing.
What about substance abuse and addiction?
Substance abuse is framed as the purest form of environmental mismatch. Evolution carefully shaped our dopamine and motivation circuitry to reward us incrementally for behaviors that enhanced survival. Finding a sweet piece of fruit, securing a mate, learning a difficult skill. But modern technology has created pure, concentrated chemical extracts like refined cocaine, heroin, or highly potent synthetic opioids, and the means to administer them rapidly via intravenous injection or smoking. These substances completely bypass the intended behavioral triggers and directly chemically hijack the brain's reward circuitry. The system never evolved defenses against this direct hijacking because these hyper-concentrated substances simply did not exist in the ancestral environment to be selected against.
Okay, let's look at personality disorders. In traditional psychiatry, these are often classified as rigid, maladaptive traits that deviate from cultural expectations. How does the evolutionary lens reframe a personality disorder?
It views them not as biological diseases in the traditional sense of a broken organ, but as rigid, extreme deployments of social strategies. Evolution equipped humans with a wide menu of strategies to navigate social groups, form alliances, and extract resources. Personality disorders occur when an individual becomes inflexibly locked into one extreme strategy, regardless of the context.
Give me an example. Let's look at borderline personality disorder.
The clinical presentation of borderline personality disorder often involves a pattern of excessive, immediate intimacy and intense adulation toward a new person, which is then rapidly followed by intense disappointment, rage, and defensive distancing at the slightest perceived slight.
The classic "I hate you, don't leave me" dynamic.
Precisely. From an evolutionary perspective, this can be conceptualized as a rigid strategy of intense personal commitment. The individual throws all of their social and emotional effort into rapidly securing one vital life-saving alliance. But because the strategy relies on absolute, unquestioning loyalty, the threat detection system is hypersensitized. The moment the other person feigns to reciprocate with equal, exhausting intensity, the borderline individual's alarm system registers a catastrophic betrayal and abandonment, leading to sudden rejection and defensive anger to protect themselves.
And what about obsessive-compulsive personality disorder?
OCPD represents an extreme devotion to duty, rule-following, and strict reciprocity. Individuals with OCPD invest heavily in doing everything perfectly according to the rules, and they expect everyone else in the social group to do the exact same. When others inevitably fail to meet these rigid standards of reciprocity, when people are messy or late or flexible, the OCPD individual is constantly disappointed, frustrated, and resentful. They are stuck utilizing only the extreme, rule-bound end of the normal spectrum of cooperative strategies.
It all comes back to how we navigate social relationships and ensure cooperation. And the sources use a classic model from game theory to map out the emotions that govern these social interactions. The prisoner's dilemma.
Game theory is essential for understanding social evolution. The prisoner's dilemma models a situation where two individuals interact. Each person has a choice. They can either cooperate with the other for a mutual benefit, or they can defect, betray the other person to secure a larger personal gain at the other's expense. Our social emotions evolved as the internal scorecard to navigate this exact game over thousands of interactions.
Let's map those emotions onto the outcomes of the game. Let's say we are interacting. If I choose to cooperate with you and you choose to cooperate with me, what is the emotional output?
The mutual payoff breeds the emotions of friendship, warmth, and trust. You are successfully building a secure, reciprocal alliance that will benefit both of our inclusive fitness in the long run.
Okay, but what if I cooperate? I share my resources with you, but you defect. You take my resources and give nothing back. You take advantage of me.
Then your brain immediately triggers anger. And importantly, it triggers spite.
Spite always seems so counterproductive. It is the urge to hurt myself just to ensure you get hurt. How is that adaptive?
In the immediate short term, spite is costly. But adaptively, over a lifetime, spite punishes the defector so severely that it alters their future calculus. It prevents them and anyone else in the tribe watching the interaction from ever defecting against you again. Spite is the enforcer of future cooperation.
And what if the roles were reversed? What if I am the one who defects and I take advantage of your cooperation?
If you are well integrated into the social group, your brain will trigger guilt and shame. Guilt is an incredibly powerful motivator. It compelled you to make reparations, to apologize, and to fix the damaged relationship before your defection is discovered by the wider group and you are permanently expelled. These emotions are not just vague feelings. They are highly evolved, specialized social calculators keeping us integrated in the tribe.
This deep dive into social manipulation brings me to a final, deeply philosophical but highly clinical question, based on the work of the evolutionary biologist Robert Trevers. If our brains are brilliantly designed to calculate social advantage, to detect defectors, and to manipulate alliances so ruthlessly, is it possible that we evolved not to know ourselves?
It is a stunning, paradigm-shifting proposition. We assume the purpose of our brain is to perceive reality accurately. But natural selection shaped our minds for reproductive success and social survival, not for objective truth. Trivers argued that the absolute best way to deceive someone else in a social competition is to truly believe the lie yourself.
Because if I know I'm lying to you, my body betrays me. I might sweat, my pupils dilate, my vocal pitch changes, my tell gives me away to your highly evolved cheater detection system.
Exactly. So an evolutionary arms race occurs within our own minds. Natural selection created a mechanism where we actively repress our own true selfish motives. We hide our darker intentions from our own conscious awareness. The classic psychodynamic defenses that Freud identified, repression, projection, reaction formation, denial, can be reconceptualized entirely as evolutionary cloaking devices.
We lie to ourselves so we can be better actors on the social stage.
Yes. Believing our own illusions makes us far more convincing to others. It allows us to secure social resources, win arguments, and attract mates without ever being detected by others or by ourselves as selfish defectors.
Which implies that the unconscious mind isn't just a passive trash bin of repressed childhood trauma. It is an active, highly strategic asset. That is a wild, destabilizing thought to hold on to as we move to synthesize today's discussion. Let's distill the core conceptual shifts from this deep dive into Kaplan and Sadok's framework.
The primary shift is moving from how to why. Evolutionary psychiatry forces clinicians to ask why the human mind harbors such profound vulnerabilities, moving beyond the proximate mechanisms of neurotransmitters. We must recognize that many emotional systems, particularly the deeply agonizing ones like anxiety, jealousy, and low mood, evolved as highly adaptive responses to specific ancestral challenges. Furthermore, modern environments create profound, unavoidable mismatches. They turn ancient survival mechanisms, like the famine response driving eating disorders or the threat detection system driving panic, into modern pathology. We also have to accept that evolution involves severe, inescapable trade-offs. Traits that heavily benefit reproductive success, such as extreme male risk-taking, frequently cause direct harm to health and longevity.
And clinically, we have to understand that psychiatric symptoms often reflect the dysregulation of these adaptive systems. This is best understood through the smoke detector principle, where a massive rate of false alarms is mathematically normal and expected. Finally, applying this evolutionary lens, utilizing the SOCIAL review to locate resource failures, or understanding depression as involuntary yielding transforms clinical interpretation. It deeply validates the patient's experience and strips away the stigma of feeling fundamentally broken.
It provides a profound narrative of survival rather than a narrative of defect.
Now, we are going to transition into our learning reinforcement segment. This is explicitly designed for the psychiatry trainees, registrars, and motivated medical students listening who want to test their clinical reasoning. Instead of just reading out textbook definitions, our expert is going to present 6 brief clinical conundrums. These are hypothetical patient scenarios. I will try to interpret the scenario using the evolutionary framework we just discussed, and I invite you, the listener, to think along with me before the underlying mechanism is revealed. Ready?
Let's begin. Conundrum 1. A 25-year-old patient presents to the clinic. The traditional psychiatric intake focuses heavily on the patient's adverse childhood experiences, investigating how early trauma may have altered their cortisol receptor sensitivity, resulting in their current hypervigilance. However, the attending physician asks you to provide an ultimate evolutionary explanation for the patient's presentation, drawing on Tinbergen's 4 questions. What is the distinction here?
Okay, if I am the trainee, I'm looking at Tinbergen's framework. The trauma altering the cortisol receptors, that is the ontogeny and the mechanism. That is a proximate question detailing how the alarm was sensitized during development. To provide an ultimate or evolutionary explanation, I need to zoom out. I need to explain why the human species possesses the genetic capacity for hypervigilance and anxiety in the first place, and how that capacity increased the inclusive fitness of our ancestors by preventing them from taking fatal risks.
That is correct. Proximate explanations address the mechanism and development within the individual's lifespan. Evolutionary explanations address the phylogeny and adaptive significance of the trait across the species' history. Conundrum 2. A 35-year-old woman presents to the emergency department, terrified. She has experienced her 4th severe panic attack this week while sitting safely in her living room. Her ECG is normal, her blood work is clean. She is weeping, saying, "My brain is completely broken, there is nothing dangerous here." What evolutionary principle explains the frequency of her attacks despite the absence of real danger?
This takes us straight back to the savannah. The patient is describing a high rate of false positive alarms. The principle at play here is the smoke detector principle. I would explain that her brain is actually functioning according to a brilliant mathematical algorithm. Because the evolutionary cost of missing a real threat, a false negative, is death, her defense system is calibrated to trigger at the slightest provocation. It results in hundreds of harmless false alarms to ensure she never misses the one real threat. Her alarm is hypersensitive, but it is not broken.
Spot on. The smoke detector principle accounts for the high rate of clinically normal yet functionally useless false alarms in biological defense systems like panic, cough, and pain. Conundrum 3. A 40-year-old executive is embroiled in a vicious, unwinnable corporate takeover. He is losing his status, his wealth, and his reputation. Despite it being clear he is lost, he cannot bring himself to quit. He subsequently develops severe psychomotor retardation, profound lethargy, and an inability to get out of bed. From an evolutionary perspective, what is the primary adaptive function of this severe low mood?
The natural instinct is to give him an antidepressant so he can keep fighting the corporate battle. But evolutionary theory suggests his low mood is executing an emergency stop. This is involuntary yielding. The adaptive function of the depression is to forcefully pause his energy expenditure. His brain recognizes he is pursuing a futile, unwinnable status goal that will eventually destroy him. The depression overrides his stubbornness, forcing him to disengage, signal defeat to his rivals, and prevent further catastrophic loss of resources.
Correct. Low mood is conceptualized not merely as a chemical deficit, but as an adaptive mechanism designed to prevent organisms from continuously wasting precious resources on fruitless endeavors. Conundrum 4. A 28-year-old woman volunteers to undergo major, painful surgery to donate a kidney to her younger sister. This act involves immense physical cost and risk to the donor, with no direct reproductive benefit to herself. How does evolutionary theory explain the persistence of such extreme self-sacrificing behavior?
If evolution was only about individual survival, she would never do this. But this is explained by Hamilton's rule of kin selection. The altruistic behavior is preserved in the human genome because the evolutionary cost to the sister donating the kidney is outweighed by the massive survival benefit to the recipient, heavily multiplied by the fact that they share 50% of their genetic material. The selfish gene promotes generosity toward identical copies of itself housed in relatives.
Excellent. Kin selection elegantly explains how genes promoting altruism can spread through a population if the behavior sufficiently benefits the inclusive fitness of relatives. Conundrum 5. You are reviewing epidemiological data in a child psychiatry ward. You notice a subtle pattern. Children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders often present with slightly higher than average birth weights, while children who later develop schizophrenia spectrum disorders often present with slightly lower than average birth weights. What highly speculative evolutionary hypothesis proposed by Bernard Crespi attempts to explain this divergence?
This brings us to the molecular battlefield of the womb. Crespi's hypothesis points to genomic imprinting and the genetic conflict between the maternal and paternal genomes. The theory speculates that autism may reflect an imprinting imbalance favoring unbridled paternal genome influence, which aggressively extracts resources leading to larger babies. Conversely, schizophrenia may reflect an excess of maternal genome influence, restricting resources to preserve the mother, leading to lighter babies.
Correct. It frames neurodevelopmental vulnerabilities as the collateral damage of a reproductive resource war fought at the genetic level. Final conundrum 6. You are a public health physician examining mortality data. You observed that the mortality rate for males aged 18 to 25, largely due to accidents, violence, and extreme risk-taking, is nearly 3 times higher than the mortality rate for females in the exact same age bracket. How does sexual selection account for this stark discrepancy?
This highlights the brutal reality that natural selection does not prioritize health or longevity. It only prioritizes inclusive fitness. Because mammalian mating systems traditionally feature high variance in male reproductive success, evolution heavily selected for traits in males that drive intense status competition and risk-taking to secure mates. These traits are selected for even though they directly physically harm the individual, whereas females are selected for longevity and sensible caution to survive the long-term demands of child-rearing.
Exactly correct. Sexual selection frequently favors extreme, physiologically costly traits in the competing sex if those traits historically guaranteed reproductive access.
This has been a massive perspective-altering journey. I strongly encourage you, whether you are a clinician sitting with a patient tomorrow or just someone trying to understand your own mind, to take this framework into your daily life. Stop looking at distress merely as a broken mechanism. Ask the why behind the symptoms. Look for the mismatched environment, the depleted SOCIAL resource, the hyperactive smoke detector.
Shifting that perspective is the essence of evolutionary medicine.
And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over, circling back to Robert Trivers and self-deception. We spend immense amounts of time, energy, and money in psychotherapy trying to achieve perfect self-awareness. We dig through our past, we analyze our motives, we try to uncover our absolute, unvarnished truth. But if Travers is right, and our brains literally evolved to deceive ourselves so we can be more effective, convincing actors in high-stakes social competitions, is the pursuit of perfect self-awareness actually working against our own biology? Are the psychodynamic defenses we work so tirelessly to dismantle in therapy actually the very evolutionary shields that keep us socially viable? It is something to seriously think about the next time your internal smoke detector goes off and you try to convince yourself there is no fire.
It is a question that challenges the very foundation of modern therapy.
Here are the details of this episode.
Evolutionary Foundations of Psychiatry. Byline. The mind we struggle with today is the mind that helped us survive yesterday.